Hello. The day started like any other. I was picking up groceries, scanning items with little thought, until I noticed the woman ahead of me in line struggling to pay. She'd carefully counted her bills, her face flushed with embarrassment as she realized she didn't have enough. Without hesitating, I stepped forward and quietly covered the rest of her bill. She looked at me, surprised and grateful, and from that small gesture, a conversation began. Her story unfolded in bits and pieces. She was a widow with 3 young children, working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. The weariness in her eyes was clear, yet so was her resilience. Something in her story struck me, a reminder of the lives and struggles people face daily, lives often hidden in plain sight. She thanked me profusely, and while I didn't expect anything in return, I asked if she would be willing to share her contact information. That night, I told my father about our encounter. My dad, a man of quiet but deeply felt generosity, listened thoughtfully, his face creased with concern. After I finished, he simply nodded, got up, and said he would look into it. A few days later, I learned that he had offered her a job at his company, an assistant secretary position with full health insurance and the flexibility to pick up her kids after school. I'd seen my dad help others before, but this time felt different. I felt proud not only because he'd done something good, but because he'd seen the value in my own instinct to help. It was a pivotal moment, one that changed how I viewed my family's wealth and influence. Growing up with unimaginable resources, it's easy to feel removed from others' challenges. But that encounter, that woman's story, made me realize that my father's wealth could create change in someone's life, and so could I. Since then, I've carried that memory as a reminder that compassion can be simple but powerful. Sometimes, it's about a small gesture, a grocery bill, a listening ear, that can spark a change far beyond what we expect. That day, my father taught me that generosity isn't just about writing checks. It's about seeing people, understanding their struggles, and finding ways to help that can truly impact their lives. Growing up as a billionaire's daughter was like living under a spotlight that never dimmed. No matter where I went, school, summer camps, even family vacations, people knew who I was, or at least they thought they did. For the most part, I learned to live with it. But it wasn't until college that I truly began to notice how deeply my family's wealth affected the way people treated me, even in relationships I thought were genuine. I remember one of my first friendships in college, a girl named Sarah. She was funny, confident, and refreshingly down-to-earth. We clicked almost instantly, sharing late-night study sessions and weekend outings. For the first time in a while, I felt like I was being seen for who I really was, not just as the rich girl. But as the semester wore on, small things started to change. Sarah began asking if we could go out to pricier restaurants just this once, and more often than not, she assumed I'd cover the bill. It seemed harmless at first, but then there were subtle jokes about daddy's money and how lucky I was to have everything handed to me. It hurt more than I'd like to admit. What started as a genuine connection felt increasingly transactional, and when I tried to talk to her about it, she brushed it off, saying I didn't get it because I didn't have to worry about money. I thought we'd move past it, but gradually, Sarah drifted away, replaced by a string of others who viewed me as an opportunity rather than a friend. They liked the idea of being around someone with money, with connections. They liked the fancy dinners, the weekends and vacation homes, but I could never shake the feeling that I was more of a convenience than a friend. There were a few exceptions, of course. Some friendships managed to survive the divide between my world and theirs. But navigating these relationships became a delicate balance of setting boundaries and watching carefully for signs that money was the only reason they were around. I learned the hard way that trust, like friendship, had to be earned. The worst part was that it wasn't just friends, it extended to dating as well. Potential relationships were clouded by questions of motivation. Did he like me, or was he interested in what my family could offer? My wealth cast a shadow over even the most promising connections, creating a sense of doubt and isolation that made it difficult to believe anyone could see beyond the fortune I'd been born into. At times, I felt frustrated, even resentful. People assumed my life was perfect, that I had no real struggles. They saw the surface and overlooked the reality of what came with it, the suspicion, the loneliness, and the constant sense of doubt that others were more interested in my family's money than in me. But over time, I learned to approach relationships differently. I became more guarded, more selective about the people I let into my life. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it helped me to see that real connections were possible. They just took a little longer to build. Looking back, those experiences taught me an important lesson. Wealth can open doors, but it can also close them just as quickly. In a world where people judged me based on my last name, it became all the more precious when I found those few who saw me simply as myself. If there was one constant in my life, it was my father's presence. Despite his demanding role as a business mogul, he always seemed to find a way to be there for my mother and me. He was a man who believed that family came first, even in a world where success often demanded everything. I admired him deeply for that, though growing up, I didn't fully understand the weight of what it took for him to balance both. Some of my earliest memories are of him coming home late, tired but never too exhausted to spend time with me. We had this routine where he'd sit with me, no matter how long his day had been, and just listen. I'd tell him about my day at school, my little victories and disappointments, and he'd listen as though every detail was the most important thing in the world. Looking back, I realize how precious that time was. He wasn't just listening, he was teaching me to value connection over ambition, to understand that success meant little if you lost sight of the people you loved along the way. One of the most memorable lessons came when I was about 14. My father had just closed a huge deal, one that had taken months of negotiation and preparation. It was a milestone for his company and would open doors he'd been working toward for years. The night he came home after finalizing the deal, my mother and I waited up for him, ready to celebrate. But he walked in, looked at both of us, and with a tired smile said, "Let's go out for ice cream." It seemed simple, almost too ordinary given the magnitude of his achievement, but that was his way. He wasn't interested in grand gestures or lavish celebrations. For him, the best way to honor his success was to share it with us, to mark the moment with a small, meaningful gesture that we'd remember more than any fancy dinner. That night, sitting together over ice cream, he told me, "No matter what you achieve, always make time for the people who stood beside you on the way there." As I grew older, I saw him carry this philosophy into every part of his life. When business opportunities conflicted with family events, he'd always choose family. It was a principle that guided him, one he rarely spoke about but lived by every day. To him, wealth and success were only worthwhile if you had the right people by your side, if you never lost the humility and kindness that made you human. It's a lesson that stayed with me, especially as I got older and saw the different ways people pursued success. There were those who sacrificed everything for ambition, who lost sight of the relationships that mattered most, and who eventually found themselves alone at the top. But my father showed me that it didn't have to be that way. He built a life where both success and family could coexist, where the people you love are never left behind. Those moments shaped me in ways I'm only beginning to understand. They taught me that no amount of wealth could replace the love and support of family. Whenever I feel pulled toward the pressures of success, I remember his words, his quiet example, and the way he showed me that family was the foundation of everything worth achieving. Being the daughter of a billionaire brought privileges that I never took for granted, but it also came with a unique pressure that I started feeling acutely in my early 20s, the expectation to give back, to make a difference. My family was known for its philanthropy, and my father had established several charitable foundations over the years, supporting causes ranging from education to medical research. Watching him write checks that would impact countless lives was humbling, but it also raised questions within me about my own responsibility and role in the world. One of the first times I joined him at a charity gala, I remember feeling a mix of awe and discomfort. The wealth in the room was staggering, with CEOs, celebrities, and socialites mingling, discussing projects to help those less fortunate. But as I observed these conversations, I realized that not everyone was there out of genuine altruism. For some, charity seemed like just another business deal, a way to improve their public image or secure social clout. I found it unsettling and couldn't help but wonder if I, too, was somehow complicit in a system that seemed to equate philanthropy with power. But my father's approach was different. For him, charity wasn't about recognition or influence, it was about helping in ways that made a tangible impact. I'd seen him work quietly behind the scenes, meeting with local community leaders to understand their needs, funding projects anonymously, and following up to ensure his donations led to real change. His humility in giving was something I deeply respected, and it made me question my own role. I knew I had the resources to do something meaningful, but I didn't want to do it out of a sense of obligation or for appearances. I wanted it to be real, purposeful. When I expressed my concerns to my father, he gave me a piece of advice that would shape my approach to philanthropy. He said, "Giving isn't about how much you give, it's about why you give. Find something that resonates with you, something you believe in, and let that guide you. Don't do it because you're expected to. Do it because you can't imagine not doing it." I took his words to heart and started volunteering at a local shelter, wanting to experience firsthand what it meant to help others on a human level. At first, it was just a few hours a week, organizing donations, helping families settle into temporary housing. But as I spent more time there, I began forming connections with the people I met, hearing their stories, understanding the struggles they faced. I realized that my father was right. True giving wasn't about writing checks or attending galas. It was about connecting with people and contributing to something greater than myself. Eventually, I founded a small organization focused on providing educational resources to underprivileged children in the area. It was modest compared to my father's foundations, but it was deeply personal, something I cared about and invested myself in fully. It wasn't about living up to my family's reputation, it was about making a difference in a way that felt authentic to me. That experience taught me that wealth and privilege come with a responsibility, but it's a responsibility that must be chosen, not imposed. True philanthropy, I learned, isn't about status or social expectations. It's about the impact we create when we act out of compassion and conviction, no matter the size of the effort. As I grew older, the need to define myself outside the shadow of my family's wealth became more than just a passing thought, it felt like a calling. I wanted to be known for my own merits, to have achievements that were mine alone. But everywhere I went, Billionaire's daughter seemed to be the only label that stuck, and it became a weight I carried, one that I was determined to shed. In college, I had decided to keep my background as private as possible, even going as far as to live modestly. I wanted to be seen as just another student, with dreams and ambitions separate from my family name. I worked part-time, took public transportation, and rarely mentioned my family unless asked directly. For the first time, I felt free from the expectations and assumptions that usually followed me. I was carving out my own path, and it felt liberating. But hiding my background didn't erase it, and there were moments when my reality would inevitably slip out. I remember a time when I invited a few close friends over to my family's home, a modest invite meant to share a weekend together. I hoped they'd simply see it as a nice home, but when they arrived, their eyes widened at the opulence. The questions began, small at first, then escalating into assumptions. They wondered why I hadn't been more open about who I really was, as if my wealth was a mask I'd been hiding behind. I explained that I wasn't hiding, but rather choosing to focus on my individual goals, my passions. But the reaction from my friends taught me a tough lesson. No matter how much I wanted to distance myself from wealth, it was a part of my identity, whether I liked it or not. People seemed to be either enchanted or intimidated by it, and I felt trapped between wanting to own my background and wanting to escape it. The internal conflict grew as I began my career. I wanted to build something of my own, to prove that my accomplishments weren't simply the product of family influence. My father encouraged this, even advising me to pursue my dreams regardless of what others expected. But the world had its own ideas. The moment my name appeared on a project, there were whispers, assumptions that it was my father's connections that opened the door. Every success I achieved was questioned, diluted by the perception that it wasn't truly earned. I struggled with this, trying to find a balance between acknowledging my privilege and forging my own identity. Over time, I realized that while I couldn't erase the wealth I was born into, I could choose how it defined me. It wasn't easy, but I began to find purpose in showing that privilege didn't mean entitlement. I worked harder, pushing myself to meet and exceed expectations, not for approval, but to prove to myself that I was capable. Through the years, I learned to stand by my choices and my achievements, confident that they were my own, even if others doubted it. I embraced the lessons my family's background offered while forging my own way forward, an identity not limited by wealth, but enriched by what I could contribute as an individual. I realized that true identity isn't about denying where you come from, it's about what you do with where you come from. Wealth could open doors, but it was up to me to choose which ones to walk through, and who I became along the way was ultimately my decision. Living within the orbit of extreme wealth brought me into contact with people I'd only ever read about, celebrities, tycoons, artists, and world leaders. For most people, these figures were distant, almost mythic, yet for me, they appeared at family events or business gatherings, each with their own quirks, stories, and unique perspectives on fame and fortune. One encounter that stands out was with a well-known actor at a charity gala. He was charismatic, larger than life, someone I had idolized since I was young. When I finally met him in person, I expected charm and conversation, but instead, he seemed preoccupied, bored even, and barely acknowledged anyone who approached him. After observing him for a while, I realized he was trapped in the very spotlight he'd once dreamed of, performing an image rather than connecting with anyone around him. It was a moment that made me question the true cost of fame. In contrast, I once met a self-made billionaire from an entirely different industry at one of my father's business functions. He was soft-spoken, approachable, and took a genuine interest in what people had to say. I was nervous, expecting him to be imposing or judgmental, but instead, he asked about my own aspirations and offered thoughtful advice. He said, "You don't have to be the loudest in the room to make an impact. Your actions will speak for you in ways words never can." Observing these two individuals taught me something profound. Fame and wealth don't necessarily bring happiness or fulfillment. They merely amplify the qualities you already have. If you are grounded, wealth can help you build and support your values. But if you are insecure or consumed by ambition, fame can be an isolating cage. Another memorable experience was a weekend retreat with other families from similar backgrounds. I saw firsthand the different ways people raised their children in the world of privilege. Some parents indulged every whim of their kids, giving them access to incredible luxuries without question. Others, like my own father, took a more disciplined approach, emphasizing hard work, self-reliance, and humility. It was here that I began to understand how much my upbringing had protected me from the pitfalls of wealth. I saw kids my age who seemed entitled, disconnected from reality, and unhappy despite all they had. It strengthened my resolve to remain grounded and to remember the values that had shaped me. These encounters with the wealthy and famous helped me realize that success alone isn't enough. It's how you define success that truly matters. Some people use wealth as a shield, a way to separate themselves from the world, while others see it as a tool for connecting more deeply. Witnessing both extremes was a revelation that left me more committed than ever to building a life focused on meaning and genuine connection, regardless of status or wealth. By the end of that weekend, I felt grateful for my father's wisdom and the unique approach he'd taken in raising me. He had shown me that wealth didn't have to define who I was. It could be a resource, a way to make an impact, but not the essence of my identity. In a world full of people chasing money, fame, and influence, I wanted to chase something different, a life of substance, authenticity, and lasting relationships. As I reached my mid-20s, the desire to build something of my own grew stronger. I'd been fortunate, of course, never having to worry about student loans, rent, or job security. But as grateful as I was, I also felt a need for independence, a sense of purpose that wasn't directly tied to my family's fortune. I wanted to stand on my own 2 feet, to see if I could make a meaningful contribution to the world without leaning on my last name. The tricky part was choosing a path that felt like mine. People in my circle expected me to join one of the family businesses, to carry on the legacy, and while that path had its merits, it didn't call to me the way it seemed to call to my father. I was more interested in areas that weren't connected to our industries, fields where I could learn and grow, even if it meant starting from scratch. I wanted to explore, to discover what I was truly passionate about, without the assumption that everything would be handed to me. After months of searching, I finally took a job in marketing at a small but innovative tech startup. It was a modest role, but it offered me something I hadn't felt before, a fresh beginning. Here, no one knew my background, and my last name didn't carry the weight it did in other places. I was just another team member, someone with ideas, goals, and a lot to learn. It felt liberating to walk into an office where people valued my contributions for what they were, not for who I was related to. The job was challenging, much more than I'd expected. I worked late nights, handled demanding projects, and faced my share of criticism. But each hurdle taught me resilience, and each success felt earned. I felt myself changing, growing more confident and self-assured. I was building my own foundation, creating a career that reflected my efforts alone. There was a distinct pride in knowing that whatever I achieved, I had done it on my terms. Over time, I learned a lot about myself and what truly mattered to me. I saw that financial independence wasn't just about paying my bills, it was about the sense of self-worth that comes from working towards something you believe in. Money had always been there in the background, but this was different. This was my money, earned through my skills and decisions, and that gave me a level of fulfillment that my family's wealth never could. There were times, of course, when my family's wealth and influence did surface. I remember one project where a potential partner discovered my background and tried to leverage it, expecting me to use family connections to benefit our work. It was tempting. He made it seem like the obvious thing to do. But I politely declined, knowing that crossing that line would undo everything I was trying to build. I wanted my success to be mine, even if that meant taking the harder road. Looking back, that job taught me far more than just marketing skills. It showed me that independence is something you earn, not something you're given. It reminded me that real success isn't measured by wealth, but by the personal growth and resilience we develop along the way. And it helped me see that while wealth can be a blessing, the most valuable assets we have are those we work for ourselves. As I moved forward in my career and began to establish my own life, I often found myself reflecting on what I wanted for my future family. My experiences, the privileges, the struggles, the realizations, had all shaped me in profound ways, and I wanted to pass those lessons on. But I also knew that the challenges I'd faced in navigating wealth and identity would likely be ones my own children would encounter as well. One of my biggest goals was to instill in them the values my father had so carefully taught me. He'd shown me that wealth could be a tool, a resource for doing good, but that it shouldn't define who we are. I wanted my children to understand that, while money can open doors, it's character and kindness that leave a lasting mark. I hope to raise them to be compassionate, resilient, and self-reliant, to see wealth not as a measure of their worth, but as an opportunity to make a difference in the lives of others. But I also knew how easy it was to get lost in the allure of privilege. I'd seen people in our social circle who, despite having everything, struggled with entitlement, loneliness, and a lack of purpose. I didn't want my children to feel insulated from reality or to see themselves as above others simply because of the lifestyle they'd been born into. I wanted them to understand that life is a blend of privilege and responsibility, of opportunity and humility, and that true fulfillment comes from the connections we make and the impact we leave behind. One day, I shared these thoughts with my father. He listened, nodding thoughtfully, before sharing his own advice. "Remember," he said, "children don't learn from what you say, they learn from what you do. Show them what it means to be kind, to work hard, to be grateful. Let them see you live out those values, and they'll carry them forward." It was simple advice, but it struck me deeply. My father had never lectured me on values, he'd simply lived by them, allowing me to learn through his example. His humility, his quiet generosity, his integrity, all of it had shaped me more than any words ever could. And as I thought about my own future family, I realized that I could do the same. I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to live in a way that aligned with the values I hoped to instill. In the years that followed, as I continued to grow and pursue my own path, I kept my father's words close. I focused on leading a life of purpose, on balancing ambition with empathy, on staying connected to the world beyond wealth. I knew that when the time came to have a family, those values would be the foundation I could pass on, not as ideals, but as a way of life. Looking back, I'm grateful for every lesson my father taught me, both spoken and unspoken. His guidance gave me a sense of identity, of grounding, and ultimately, of hope for the future. I may have been born into a world of privilege, but the life I wanted to build was one that valued people over possessions, character over convenience, and meaning over materialism. And that, I realized, was the legacy I wanted to leave for my own family, a legacy rooted in the quiet, steadfast values that had shaped my own life so. Bye-bye.